What if business owners could visualize their future legacy? I'd like to welcome Bradley Franc. He's joining us today from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he has a consulting firm known as the Succession Solution. Welcome, Bradley.
It's a pleasure to be here, Angelina. Thank you for the invite.
It is my pleasure. And to all the listeners out there, he will be the second Penn State alumni guest, so a fellow Nittany Lion, to talk about legacy planning, succession planning, and what business owners face. So let's start off with a question of real time challenges that face family businesses. Would you provide a few examples that stand out from your memory and experience?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So two come to mind. One is very early in my consulting practice. There was a business that actually had three owners and some family members involved in it. And I had a good relationship with them. And they said, "Hey, Brad, we want to do some succession planning, but we have it all figured out. We're all on the same page." I said, "Okay." So I do my due diligence and I interview the three main owners, and they all pointed north in different directions. We quickly realized one wanted to stay, didn't want to sell it. One wanted to sell, and one wanted to sell it to the employees. And so first, making sure we have a common vision was really important, and they didn't. And so what we did, we engaged an investment banker, determined a value. They weren't happy with the value if they sold it. We went to the employees. The employees would have loved to own the business, but they couldn't afford it. And the other gentleman wanted to stay, and he was kind of stuck. So after about a year of investigating, Angelina, I introduced the concept of an ESOP, an employee stock ownership plan. They had never heard the term. They would have never thought of the term. We would never have got there unless we had walked down that hallway of what are our options. And I'm happy to report they converted to an ESOP 2 years ago. They increased their value by 80% 2 years ago and 100% this year. It's an incredible story, right? And they're
Yes.
really, really happy. The other story was a family owned. They were owned by two siblings, and there were four heir apparents, and they couldn't decide which of the four in-laws, and they were all in-laws, to take over. And they had met with me, and they said they hired national consultants, and they came up with four books of these are the candidates. Well, they knew those were the candidates. And they said two of the four were candidates, but we haven't been able to do anything for 2 or 3 years. I took them through the process, and it was difficult. And at the end of the day, they selected a CEO. And I don't think they would have got there, but if they had not followed the process that I implemented. So.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful story. And in my due diligence, I heard you speak about that. There was one individual, he was young and he thought about, as the youngest owner, about his future and what was the best decision. So they all had different motivations coming to the table. So let me bring up a couple of statistics in my research. So I think you've said about 84% of family businesses achieve a successful succession when an orderly transition plan is in place. And yet, so few are willing to come to the table to open up the conversation. And I just am so surprised by that because we see the numbers, whether it's 30% survive as the first generation G1, maybe less than that. We cut that number in half when it comes to G2 or generation two. And if you get to the third generation, gosh, then all of these mantras and expressions, whether it's shirt tails to shirt tails, teacups to teacups, stalls to the stallions, and back again, and right?
Right. You've got it. Absolutely correct. It is remarkable that the statistics that you provided, that if they follow and document a process where they engage the important stakeholders, their opportunity for success increases dramatically. Whereas if they don't, the statistics hold true as well, that they aren't successful. And a million years ago, this is how I sort of started down my road. I went up to New York City and I went to this, high-powered tax conference. And there were 200 or 300 people in the room, tax professionals in the room. A partner got up at the dais and gave these statistics. And she said, "You know whose fault it is?" And she pointed to all of the professionals. "It's your fault for not communicating this to your clients." And that sort of started me down the road for succession planning.
Yes, that's direct right there. Yeah, so I think it's just fascinating. And I think another statistic, just this is to provide context to any of the listeners, many of the listeners are under age 40 that tune into YouTube, but for the Apple podcast, it's more diversified. But one of the other statistics for context is I think you had mentioned PricewaterhouseCooper mentioned something along the lines of 33% who have a documented plan are much better off because that is, I think, about the 30% that do make it. So if somebody has a plan, it reminds me of a statistic by Tony Robbins that says success is 51% of success is simply just showing up. And yet we have to have the individuals show up. And so I think this is a part of expanding the conversation today around what it is, what you've seen. So it doesn't have to be so scary to enter this conversation of visualizing the future or having the business owners understand that letting go can be a beautiful thing. It doesn't mean that it's the end of their life or something tragic.
No, I agree with you. And I will tell you, Angelina, that there are many clients I work with. They were initiated or instigated by that next generation, by that younger generation, who care about the survival of the business. They want to help their parents leave a legacy, and they nudge them along. One of the jokes I give is the older generation is there to frustrate, the younger generation is there to irritate, right? You sort of have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. But it's really, really important because, as you indicated, the research is pretty clear that the folks that get it right have a process to follow and an open communication within which to communicate that process.
Yes. So if we look again, and this will be the last statistic that I mentioned in today's conversation, so about 60% has to do with great communication and trust. And if that's there, that can guarantee success. So I thought, wow, how fascinating. So 15% has to do with the technicalities, and maybe 25% ballpark has to do with an underprepared successor. We're still looking at the bulk of it, 60%. I mean, that's over 50%, just basic communication and trust skills,
And
capacity.
Angelina, I have to tell you, as a former CPA and a lawyer, I was heartbroken when I saw that statistic. It's not the lawyers and CPAs that get it wrong. As a matter of fact, successful business owners, they hire good professionals, right? That's why such a small percentage of the failure relates to the technical issue. And 60% as far as trust and communication. And trust doesn't mean, you're going to steal my lunch. Trust is, hey, Angelina, can you have that report on my desk on Monday? Monday comes along. Where's Angelina? Well, she's out, right? You can't trust, you can't rely on her, right? But isn't it really just basic, even with all relationships? Communication and trust. It's sort of the foundation within which we have interpersonal relationships. You got to be able to communicate and you got to be able to trust the person.
Yes, and I might plug coactive coaching right now for a moment. One of the key pillars in the methodology has to do with the perspective. It's known as the perspective wheel, and being able to see someone else's perspective to understand, what are the reasons of why they're choosing to not provide that report at Monday at 11 a.m. Why is it that they're out on the golf course? Maybe it is to secure a deal, but when there is not the openness for communication, much gets lost, and then the presumptions and judgments are made of the us versus them, and they let me down, and the pointing of the fingers and so forth. But so here's my next question. Why do you think it is so hard for individuals to clarify their values, even starting there, bringing a group of people into a room? And I know that you had success in the story you shared of those three business owners, whether they were going to go with an ESOP or, all the options that they could explore. But
Right.
why is it so hard for individuals to clarify their values and be honest?
Yeah, I think there is a variety of reasons. What's that quote? The important is seldom urgent, and the urgent is seldom important. Business owners, they get caught up in the day to day. I'll take care of that matter tomorrow. I'll address that. I think so. I think distractions, and I think it's fear. I think it's really fear that prevents people from sharing their values in a room uh, because their values may not be shared by others. So, one business owner says, "Hey, to his family, I want out in 3 years. And all of a sudden, what does that mean to me and my job, Dad? If you sell to a third party, I may. So it's that fear factor of disclosing how you really feel. And I tell people, Angelina, all progress begins with the truth. If you can't have that communication, it ain't going to work.
That's fascinating because when money is connected, like you had mentioned, if there's that young individual and they have that job connected to that family business and they say, "Hey, mom or pops, what happens if you sell?" And that's the income they're relying on, and they've never had to, quote, make a cold call in their life. Oh,
Angelina, when I was in college at Penn State, I had a friend of mine who 4 years told me he was going to work for his dad, and has a very successful business. The year he graduated, his dad sold the business. He never knew it was coming, and it took him about a decade to get his career back in order.
that's one of the conversations I think oftentimes is not brought up enough. If, let's say, somebody does take, whether it's 3 years off to take care of their aging parents, or they take time off for whatever reason, their ability to re enter the marketplace can oftentimes be judged by human resource professionals. I mean, there's many different blind spots that need to be brought up and looked at almost like a prism, because there's so many facets to the ripple effect of, if a business owner makes a decision, and then how does it impact all the people around them, whether that's the next generation, the shareholders, and so forth. Yes.
And that's why I tell business owners, look, you don't have to follow what your daughter, what your son, what your wife, what your brother say, but it's important to communicate and have a conversation. I say, give them oxygen to breathe, let them speak, give their view. You may find that you're missing something, to your point about the blind spot, but at the same time, you are engaging them and they feel respected, and can plan their future.
Yes. So do you think the ability to communicate transparently is a different skill set once somebody has achieved financial success?
I think it becomes easier. It's always hard, but I do think it becomes easier. And that's actually one of the things that I make sure that I have a conversation with the business owner when we're talking about succession planning is, what do you need? I joke, what's your number, right? I want to give this business to my daughter. Okay, well, will you've used this business to live off of? What are you going to live off of? And sometimes they just miss that stuff. And so that's, really important conversation to have.
Yes, very much so. One of the things you had also mentioned is you really liked a book called Legacy that was done by a New Zealand rugby coach. And he made a point about getting it down to get it right, even if it's just a single page.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I have, I've designed my succession planning process to one page. It's called the Succession Solution Roadmap, and I'd be happy to talk to you about the stages. And to your point on legacy, which is a great book, I'd suggest that people read. If you want to get everybody on the same page, use one page. And we use this one. It's 11 and a half by 18 piece of paper, but it works really, really well, because what happens, Angelina, and we've talked about a little before, there's lots and lots of issues going on with succession planning, and you can't capture everything. But if you could get 80%, so here's one of the jokes I give. So if you had a project and you only got 80% done at the first meeting, and you got 20% left, and you got 80% done at the next meeting, you'd be 96% complete, right? And so it's, get it down and get it right is another one of my lines. And so we use this roadmap to capture as much as we can and continue to improve the process.
Yes. Another, and I'm just bringing this up right now because I thought this was great content. You brought up a quote, and I'm not sure if it's yours or someone else's. You had said, "A plan without action is nothing but a dream, while action without a plan is just passing time."
Yeah, I would love to take credit for it, but that's also from Legacy.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. Interesting. Interesting.
yeah, yeah,
Well, I have a couple of minutes here with you right now, and I thought maybe I'll just run through the 6 stages of the succession solution.
sure.
I'll just briefly touch upon them, and maybe it'll be to entice any of the listeners to purchase your book, and there'll be a link in the description. You start out with purpose, looking at values, vision, and their why. Tell me more.
Yeah, and so I think that in any project, in any commitment, you have to sort of lay the foundation of your principles, your core values. What's important to you? Is it family? Is it the employees? Because along the line, Angelina, there will be issues, conflicts, hard questions, and we go back to our foundation. Why, what's our core values? Are we violating those principles? So why I start there. And I don't do anything until we get that down. Then I say, okay, if these are our core principles, what's our vision, right? In the Bible, it says, without vision, we all perish, right? We need something to go toward. And interestingly, I came across this a couple of years ago. The difference between a vision and a goal: a vision requires no action. This is what we're looking out toward. And then lastly, Simon Sinek, First Start with Why, another terrific book. So I say, okay, if this is your vision and these are your core values, why? Right? So I'd met a guy a couple of years ago. He says, I want to be a billionaire by the time I'm 50. I said, why? He goes, I don't know. I think it'd be kind of cool. My guess is he's not going to get there, right? You need to, it sort of goes back to testing. It goes back to testing your core values. So.
Yes. And I think one of the other questions you will ask your clients directly is, where are you headed?
Yeah, so that's the next stage, is the discovery stage. And you would be amazed, Angelina, how many business owners think they know what they have. It's because they're too busy and they don't know where they are, whether their will gives it everything to their daughter when they want to go to their son, or whatever the case may be, or there's a shareholders agreement, there's not a shareholders agreement. The joke that I give, I hate going to the mall. But when I go to the mall, what's the first thing I do? I look for that big block at the entrance, look for the red dot. It says, this is where you are. And if I want to get to the Apple store, I need to know, am I going up? Am I going down? And that's the discovery stage, finding your red dot.
Yes, very much so. I know one of the things you've also mentioned is, and I don't know if this is your quote again, something along the lines of the willingness to talk about it, because all progress begins with truth.
Yeah, yeah, and I mentioned that. Yeah, we have to, that sort of leads to that next stage I call the challenge stage, which I believe is probably the most important. Right? We know where we want to go, we know where we are, and we need to identify the threats, the obstacles, the risks. What's preventing us from getting there? Keith, if I can digress for a second, Keith Cunningham wrote a terrific book. It's called Down the Road Less Stupid. And he said, strategic planning is real simple. This is how it works. You find out where you want to go. You find out where you are. You find out what's in your way, because if nothing was in your way, you'd be there already. You build a machine to get over it, and you see how the machine operates, right? And so in my succession plan, by the way, I did my roadmap before I read that book. We got the vision, we got the discovery, and then we say, okay, what's in our way? My wife can't stand my son-in-law. I can't work with my brother. I need to sell the business because I need to retire. Whatever those are, get them on the table, get them down, because I believe that this is where your opportunities lie. When you can identify your obstacles and threats, you can get there. If you don't, that 2x4 you don't see coming is going to hit you over the head sooner or later. So that's the third stage.
Yeah, I want to absolutely agree with you about that 2x4 metaphorically, because I think when a business owner or their next gen or anyone in that room can see the blind spots and have the courage to take that inventory, how much better they are for it. Even if taking an inventory means that they have to look underneath the carpet at those things that they don't want to talk about, or they might not be ready to talk about, but if they procrastinate longer, whether it's a year or in this changing environment, that conversation that they're not having can be so detrimental. Or it could be that opportunity when I think that there's a phrase about there's a breakthrough after there can be a breakdown, but somebody can be better after having that breakdown to look at those hard moments or hard truths that might be uncomfortable to bring up, like so and so doesn't like so and so, or that fear about working with that person, or all those things people don't want to come out and say, but they're better if they can say it in a respectful way, in a respectful, safe space.
And you said it, you ended it, that was perfect, because I believe when I'm involved in the process, and it's just not me, but when you bring in a facilitator, addressing those issues and obstacles actually aren't as hard as people think they are. It's that fear factor. And once they get it out, then all of a sudden they feel really comfortable talking about other issues and they open up. But they need a catalyst. And so I force them, and that's why it's in this roadmap. I force them to say, okay, what are the obstacles? And they say, there are no obstacles. Okay, well, if there isn't, then I guess we can do this, this, and this. No, 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 we can't do this, this. So you sort of have to get it out from them, which I'm sure is what you do to a large degree.
Absolutely. They say sometimes coaching is to provoke and inspire, although I don't know sometimes if people always like to be provoked. So let me return to your list. Thank you so much. So number one, purpose. Number two, determine their current situation, like the metaphor you shared about the red dot in the shopping mall. Three, it's not necessarily a SWOT analysis, but it is looking at their strengths, opportunities, and obstacles, what you just mentioned. Is there anything else you'd like to share about that?
Well, yeah, two things. One, I do think that we identify the obstacles, and I say, okay, if we get over these obstacles, what good things will come from it, right? And more often than not, it's we'll be able to recruit employees because they won't be fearful of what the family is going to do, or we'll be able to maintain employees. And so there's a lot of good things that give you the jet fuel to continue. But the last thing I also like to ask them is, okay, what does failure look like? If we get this wrong, what does failure look like? Right? Because there's always, it's always good to run towards something, but it's just as important to run away from something, right? We don't want this to happen. And so we have to articulate that as to what failure looks like.
That's beautiful. Thank you. That is a very powerful question. And I just want to share quickly that when you had talked before about the catalyst, when COVID happened, even though I don't come from a family business on my father's side, he's a 12th generation American. So there is some roots and identity and so forth, even though I don't come from a family business. I just will have that disclaimer. But what I did during that time period was I interviewed both my mother and father for about 10 or 11 hours. I did it an hour a day. And I will tell you that was one of the best decisions I made in my life because all of these stories came out. And of course, my response was, well, why didn't you tell me that when I was 13 years old? Or why? Because
Yeah.
it would have made for such a more fulfilling relationship in my teenage years or in my adolescence, childhood, etc., if I would have had those reference points. But oftentimes, if we don't ask, people don't bring up the answers and they're in being vulnerable. But you're right. Once the door opens, whoo.
Too much information. No, no, I agree. I mean, I'm a big believer in more information than less. Then you can sort of identify what's important. But yeah, that's why I tell young professionals, it's not what you tell people that's important. It's what you ask. And well-prepared questions are just as important as what you tell people.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, I know you made that point. More information is better. You'd rather have more at your fingertips than less, because if you're walking into a room and you have to make a decision, please don't hide anything from me, because again, you don't want to make a decision based off of blind spots. So yes, so yeah, I think that is a great place to start. So whether someone's in a family business or not, sometimes it just starts at the kitchen table or the dining room table to get curious, because there is so much wisdom. And oftentimes, as I mentioned in the preamble, people think limiting beliefs that what they have to share is not good enough or not important enough. And that's really where the gold is at.
I
Yes.
completely agree. I
So
completely agree.
I think the fourth of the succession solution in the fourth stage is developing 3-year objectives. Tell me
Right.
more.
Yeah. And so, Bill Gates is famously quoting, most people overestimate what they can do in a year and they underestimate what they can do in 10. So I say to the business owner, hey, look, we're not selling your company. We're not transferring your business today. Um, 3 years from today, we're sitting here, 3 years from today, what would you like to see have happen with the succession plan to feel good about your progress? Because if I said to you, Angelina, hey, can you do 100 push-ups next week? You kind of freak out. If I said, hey, if you had 3 years to do 100 push-ups, it'd be a little easier. So it makes it a little easier to look out 3 years. And I say, okay, these are the things we want to do over the next 3 years. Objective criteria. We form a board of directors. We value the business. I determine how much my retirement is, whatever they are, right? And then once again, we say, what's preventing us from getting there, and then what are the strategies that we're going to deploy. Well, I want my son to take over, or I want my daughter to take over. Okay, what's the obstacle? She's not ready. Okay, what's the strategy? We're going to get some training. We're going to hire Angelina for some personal development, that kind of stuff. So that's the mission stage.
That's wonderful. I think looking out 3 years is practical. It's not so far out like 5 or 10 years, and yet it's almost like a military debrief regarding different scenarios to be prepared. Yes, which fits nicely with the 5th stage of establishing 1-year milestones.
Yeah, and so I say to you, Angelina, so this is where we want to be 3 years from today. So over the next 12 months, what do we need to do to get us closer to our 3-year objectives, which will get us closer to our vision, right? And so then we peel the onion back just a little bit more and get a little more specific about the things that we're going to do. What are those obstacles? What are those things we need? Well, we don't have time. We're too busy. Okay, well, how can we strategize? There's time in the day. And then what are the tactics versus strategies? Strategies are a little longer term. What are the tactics? And then, what are those key results? What are those specific things? Because I'm a big believer in objective criteria. Give you an example. I want to lose weight. Well, how do you know if I did it or not? Well, I want to lose 10 pounds, right? So or whatever that case may be, you want to identify some specific objectives. So no one in the group is arguing you did or you didn't accomplish this. So.
Yes. And I think the last stage is setting quarterly tasks in the form of a list, whether it's the next 90 days or so forth. And I know one of the things, before you speak on that you've shared, is not only do you want to know more than less, but you'd rather know sooner than later.
That's right. And so another great book is called The 12-Week Year. And the authors talk about we should all plan our lives around 12 weeks, long enough to get stuff done, but short enough to keep our eye on the ball. And this is where I think my process differs from most people, is I say, okay, guys, this is what we're going to do in a year. Over the next 90 days, what are we going to do? And there'll be 4 or 5, and that's the most, 4 or 5 specific things we're going to do to move us closer. And we're going to identify a person who doesn't have to do it all, but will report out in 90 days. It is remarkable, Angelina, when I call like 45 days. Well, I haven't really got to it yet. But when it gets closer and closer, it gets done. And by the way, if something doesn't get done, it's not the end of the world. You say, is it still important? Yes, it's still important. Well, let's move it to the next quarter. And so that's the specific things that we get done. And usually by the second or third quarter, that flywheel that they talk about starts spinning, and we really start to make progress.
Yes. Thank you for speaking into that. I think a lot of times if people can kind of get some clarity around the process, it's less scary to talk with a trusted advisor or a consultant. And so if they kind of know, I mean, the metaphor that I've referred to as maybe simple as it might be is, if you're going to walk through the forest and you've got a Boy Scout or Girl Scout leader, that guide can say, look out for the poison ivy and look out for the rocks so we can make it to the boat by the lake. Because a lot of times people don't bring up these conversations or thoughts because they don't want to do it alone, or they fear something being taken away from them, even though the thing that could be entering their life could be just as exciting. It could be the next stage of the trip around the world, or the next thing that they could do on their bucket list. And so it could be very rewarding to transition, whether it's through succession or, again, if someone's in family business, fantastic. If they're not, there's still a transfer of knowledge and skills to the next generation that is so valuable.
I agree. And you said something, and it's so true. It may seem simple, right? I tell people all the time, my succession solution roadmap and process is simple, but it's not easy, right? And it's simple is it's outline form. People can understand it. They can connect the dots. But it's not easy having a discussion about obstacles. It's not easy saying where you want to be 3 years, because you are creating your destiny and you want to get it right, right? Because there's a fear of you get it wrong. And so even I tell people this is an operating system for succession planning. There are other operating systems out there. I just think the one that I have created seems to work really well for me and the clients I work with.
Yes. Well, if you know it from personal experience, then you don't even need the book in the room. You know it in your heart and in your mind. Yes. verbatim. Yes.
That,
There is
that,
there is one more statistic I'd like to throw in there, but this is to provide hope to any of the listeners or viewers. I think you had mentioned a study by Cornell University that 16% of the time there was only failure, something along the line, there was only 16% of the time was there a failure when the owner actually followed an orderly transition plan. And so they were much better off if they even just showed up to have the tough conversations.
it's so true. And again, I realize it's hard, and I really appreciate you having me on the show because it's those types of statistics that are such eye openers that if I had a business and I wanted to transfer it and I knew the success rate was so high by documenting, why wouldn't I do that, right? The other statistic I just want to share, if I may, is the Boston Consulting Group. They did a study and they found that, and they talked to private equity people that buy and sell companies, right? Private equity firms, that a company that has a defined succession plan is usually worth 1 to 2 turns in value. So if a company sells for 5 times a multiple, it'll sell for 6 or 7 times a multiple. So,
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So it took you about 4 years to write your book. So I can relate to that because I haven't released my book yet because it's second guessing everything and wanting it to be very high quality. So would you change anything looking back now?
well, first, let me give you a piece of advice, Angela. You're never done. You're always changing it. And I did change it. There was a second edition. And I added a chapter called fair may be equal, but equal may not be fair. And it's sort of about fairness because, the 2 kids come home, I give one candy bar to one and I don't give it to the other. What do they say? That's not fair, right? I explain to people how to use fair. Don't let fear be used as a weapon, but use it as a tool, right? And so that was what I had missed. The other thing I would change based on my experiences, I'd probably add a chapter for that next generation. How does the next generation get this started? Because I hear that from a lot of young folks. My parents won't do this, my uncle won't do this. How do I get them motivated? I can't get them. They get very, very frustrated. So that would be the one thing I might add.
Yeah, I think that's important because as much as sometimes the founding generation or those that come prior to, I might be putting my foot in my mouth a little bit right here, but as much as they say, oh, we love the ideas of young people, sometimes it can be lip service because they don't want to take a risk. And so the next gen is right there. And so it's a very interesting dichotomy because then how much does the next generation push versus back off? But then then the conversation dies. And yeah, and the next gen will say, well, I tried and I was turned down, and so I'm not going to try again. So yes,
Yeah, that's a great point because you need to understand that the founder or the senior generation, their whole retirement, their security is wrapped up in this business. And the younger generation say, let's try this, let's try this. The older generation is like, no, 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 don't screw it up. And guess what? That is a failure. That is a recipe for failure because as a business, you have to constantly innovate. If you're not willing to change, what's that saying? What got us here won't get us there. And so there's a tension there between the younger generation that may want to take some risks and the older generation says, don't screw it up, right?
yes. And it's also interesting. I'm going to go deep for a moment. It's also interesting if there could be an underlying belief around identity. If, let's say, for the business owner or the individual that started it, or even if they're generation two and they took it further in scale, if there's an underlying belief that their identity is connected to it or their self-worth is connected to it, let's say if they had a helicopter parent and they can never prove themselves enough, now if you pull that business away and even ask them to sign something on the dotted line regarding a succession plan, whoo, there are some deep rooted things that have not been brought up that they could be set free from. Yes.
Angelina, I have to tell you, it's in my book as well. One of the largest clients I work with is $1 billion. I was talking to the senior CEO and he was having this issue. And he said, Brad, I fear that I'm going to go from he's the guy to who's he.
That's very honest. And that's why the sensitivity is required for all the other people in the room to recognize and acknowledge that whole human being and being human centric, not
Right.
just systems
That's
relevant.
what the example I give And he's found other opportunities and things to do with his life, moving into a chairman of the board. But it's like the Tarzan movie. Tarzan, swinging the vines, right? Tarzan didn't let go of a vine until he saw another vine to reach out. And it's hard for a CEO and owner to let go of a vine unless there's another vine that he or she can reach out toward.
It's a very powerful thing to have a reason to wake up in the morning. And until we've been in the shoes of someone who didn't have a reason, that is a powerful metaphoric vine to reach forward because that is a reason to wake up.
That's right. That's
Yes.
right. And so this is why only 15% of failure is due to a technical tax issue. It's communication, it's trust, it's preparing that next generation.
Yes. So, since this is a legacy podcast and I have limited time with you right now, what does the word mean to you personally when you reflect and become introspective about this word,
As far as the word legacy,
the word legacy?
yeah. So legacy means, to me, it's what lessons that I can leave for my children and my family.
Beautiful. What would you like your holistic legacy to be?
That there is actually two things, and as simplistic as they may seem. And someone asked me this question: to be nice to people, even though they're not nice to you, and the golden rule, right? Treat others as you'd want them to treat you. And I've lived by that motto, and I've made most of my mistakes is not following those mottos. And so, as simplistic as that may seem, it would be those two.
Well, I think that's a beautiful answer. It's filled with wisdom because what is that other expression? People don't remember what you knew; they remembered how you treated them. And love is one of the highest vibrations,
That's right.
right?
That's right.
So even if it's your daughter that says, "Wow, my dad he made me always feel very important. I knew I was loved unconditionally, whether I achieved valedictorian status or so it's just yeah, that's a beautiful value to have.
Yeah, if I may, just real quickly, I was listening to a religious speaker the other day. He was talking about how we prioritize things. What's number one, what's number two, what's number three, what's number four, and he talking about, well, we'll make church number three or whatever. It's on the list. He says, if you make it number one, two, three, and four will work out for you. If you make it three or four, one, two, and three may not happen. So it's those basic foundational questions, I believe, will dictate whether you're quote unquote successful, whatever that means or not.
Absolutely. I think being in service to other people needs to get more acknowledgement, even though I realize our business magazines celebrate the top 50 wealthiest individuals and the accolades and so forth. So, in addition to love, what are some of the other top core values that you get to honor in your life today and or would like to project forwards?
Yeah, well, and it goes towards my coaching, right? One of my core values is trust, right? So I've got to make sure that there's a relationship of trust when I'm working with somebody, and they can trust me. So the other core principle is empowerment. How can I empower these people? How can I take what I have and help and use that information to help them? I mean, one of the things that people would tell me in law school and when I was a CPA is, Brad, you can explain things that most people can't, and I can understand them. And so empower them with my wisdom so that then they can take that information and use it for their benefit, right? And the other one is objectivity. I got to be able to tell you, Angelina, when I think you're wrong or how I disagree. I got to be able to I got to be honest with you. And then the last one, as I tell people, is results oriented. If I read this the other day, and I'm going to get it wrong. If you don't use my advice, I'm not worth anything. I have no value, right? So hopefully I'll be results oriented. People will say, "Hey, Brad, help me." I didn't give them all the answers. Help guide, and we got these results. And so that's kind of trust, empowerment, objective, and results oriented. Hopefully that's helpful.
That's very helpful. I just appreciate that you're speaking into them because if someone's watching, they could reflect and think, well, I wonder what my values are. Because oftentimes we could be so involved with the mouse wheel that we don't slow down enough to think, what are my values? And then there's it's kind of a metaphor in early education. It's you do, we do, I do, or I do, we do, you do. So if Brad speaks into it, maybe I can do it too. And so it's
Absolutely.
yeah. So you get to go first.
Leadership by example.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think those are great values. I know sometimes next gen members, but individuals in general, regardless of age or generation, can oftentimes be afraid to ask a CPA or an attorney a question so that the concept can be simplified. They don't want to ask that quote dumb question, or I don't want to ask that stupid question, and so they don't ask, and they need to. So I
Yeah.
appreciate your value around empowerment, so that phrases and concepts and new learnings can be broken down and not be so intimidating.
I had another professional tell me, he quoted me on a line I give clients all the time. I say, if Angelina, if I can't explain something to you that you don't understand, I'm either lying to you or I don't understand it myself.
That's honest. That's
Yeah.
honest. So, if you were, let's say, to set aside a weekend or two in the next 6 months and create a hardcover coffee table book of your personal legacy, what would be in its chapters, with themes, pictures, and so forth for the next generation?
Yeah, I know you don't know this, but I wrote a book before this one, the Succession Solution, called Choose Your Own Roles, where I outline sort of my life philosophy and the steps during my process. And so, my personal legacy has been continuous improvement, continuous education, continuous reading. Another great quote I just saw the other day: you're never old if you continue to study and learn. So,
That's wise.
yeah.
Yes.
Think about that. I mean, if you're 80 years old, you learn new stuff. You're not an old person. It's you're becoming a new person, right? And that's
Everything is still fresh.
right. Exactly.
Yes. Yes. What did you enjoy the most about writing your book?
Finishing. But no, actually, honestly, there was a law school professor who once told me writing is the highest form of thinking. So I had this process and I had used it, but I wasn't 100% sure it was right. And so I committed it to writing. And at the end, I said, you know what? This is right. And I've proved it by my research and my writing. So that was the biggest takeaway.
That's lovely. And best Nittany Lion memory?
Yeah, so there are several, but the ones that are subject that are allowed for public communication, right? It would probably be I was an accounting major, and at the time, the idea was to get a job offer from one of which now is the Big Four, the four largest accounting firms, and it was the day that I received an offer to work for EY, Ernst and Young. That was professionally as a student. I mean, you like to think you send your kids to school to get a job, and it wasn't a lot of money, but it was more money than either one of my parents ever made in their entire life. And I was actually embarrassed to tell my parents how much I was making, but it was just one of those moments like, wow.
That's a wonderful story, because I think that there are new moments when somebody, and I think Penn State does a great job, like many universities out there, in preparing their students for the next chapter and the next open door, and making sure that they know a lot, whether it's the Smeal College of Business or another one of the colleges on that campus.
Yeah.
Yes. Any closing thoughts, or what is the best way a listener or viewer would be able to reach you to learn more?
Yeah. So all they need to do is type in the successionsolution.com and they can reach out to me. And I'm always willing to talk to people on my nickel, Angelina. Um, I just spoke to somebody from Singapore the other day. My book's been sold in 15 different 15 different countries. So if they want to get the book, they can go on Amazon. But just please go to my website and reach out to me. And I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. As a matter of fact, I think that's how we connected. So they can reach out to me in all sorts of different ways. And I'm happy to help people whenever I can.
That's lovely. That's lovely. Thank you so much, Mr. France, for your
Thank you.
time today in speaking about this subject. And you're absolutely right. I think one of the challenges is that business owners can come across what are those day-to-day operations and management, and not realize that what they put off till tomorrow or what they fear are exactly the conversations that they could be having today. And so thank you for speaking into your expertise and knowledge within this area. One of the slogans of legacy planning is wealth from knowledge, and so it begins with knowledge. It's looking around the corner, it's looking at those blind spots, it's having those tough conversations, and maybe not even such tough conversations, because like you had said, well, what's the benefit, what's the success? And so it's also a very positive thing. So I'm going to just read out my closing paragraph real quick. So, in closing, I'm Angelina Carleton, the hostess of the Design Your Legacy podcast, as well as the founder to Legacy Planning, a boutique advisory firm based out of Beverly Hills, California, USA, but international in those I consult. I hope to dive deep into subjects that can help a person to find, develop, and execute their legacy, and continue to scour the landscape for those who can be great resources to every dimension of your legacy. For many listeners, there can never be enough education and preparation in the moat around your castle. Whether you find yourself with new wealth or generational wealth, may the content on this channel be an anchor in any storms ahead. We do our best to provide original content for your intellectual and emotional curiosity. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you're tuning in on Apple, please remember to rate and review. Or if you're checking us out on YouTube, please remember to subscribe, comment, and so forth. So thank you so much for joining us this week. And thank you, Bradley, for speaking into your legacy.
Thank you.